Well, I am trusting that last week went well, that Vince brought you a message. I think it was out of 1 Corinthians 3:16. He did send me some of the notes on that ahead of time, and it's always good to hear from a very seasoned pastor and one whose wisdom is a lot to be drawn from. And so I'm hoping and trusting that you got a lot out of that. Well, today is Mother's Day, and although I'm not always inclined to preach according to a calendar of man-made holidays, other than Christmas and Easter because of their religious significance, days like today are a good reminder to revisit the importance of family relationships, particularly those between parents and children. This day produces a variety of emotions for people. For some of you, it's a happy day as you honor your mother or perhaps the mother of your children. For many of you, you are the mom who gets honored by your kids today. For others, it's a great sadness because maybe your mom is no longer around to embrace, and it's especially hard if it's the first or the second Mother's Day without your mom. For some, Mother's Day or Father's Day is an uncomfortable reminder of a relationship that's not exactly worthy of a hallmark sentiment. Perhaps there's still a bitterness or resentment toward a mother who wasn't exactly ideal. Some Christians might even wonder, as a Christ follower, how is one supposed to honor parents who maybe weren't really cut out to be a parent or were less than ideal or maybe even downright antagonistic toward their children, or perhaps even led a self-centered life and left the family altogether? Most of us in here have been fortunate enough to not have experienced that, but there are some who have, and I can guarantee you that you are in contact with people every day, though, that did or do experience that kind of home life. And we're going to address that this morning as well. To start, however, whenever I think about parent-child relationship, my mind immediately goes to the very first Bible verse I ever memorized, taught to me by the pastor that I grew up with at Union Christian Church, Floyd Miller, which some of you know. Now, growing up, Floyd and I had a very special relationship, and as a little kid especially, and for me, and anytime he would come over to our house, he would make me quote this verse to him. I learned it not necessarily because I loved the verse, but because Floyd would often take me to basketball games, and in order for me to be able to go, I had to kind of quote this verse to him without opening the Bible. So that was kind of where my memory comes from. But admittedly, I haven't always followed it successfully, but I memorized it. It's a simple one that comes from Ephesians 6, and as you see the scripture there, and it simply says that children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land. And I particularly love the way the Living Bible paraphrases this verse, that the children obey your parents. This is the right thing to do because God has placed them in authority over you. Honor your father and mother. This is the first of God's 10 commandments that ends with a promise, and this is the promise, that if you honor your father and mother, yours will be a long life full of blessing. That's just a paraphrased version of that. This command from God and this reiteration by Paul, the author of Ephesians, reminds us of the important principle that the quality of our life, and perhaps even the length of it, is directly connected to our attitude toward those in authority over us, especially our parents. Now notice that it's connected to our attitude, not necessarily to the way the parents were, but it's connected to our attitude toward those in authority over us. And not just to our attitude, but also in how we express ourselves toward our parents, regardless of how we may feel about them. It's important to point out, too, that the Bible is not oblivious to the parents' responsibility in this relationship. In fact, in the very next verse, Paul tells parents not to treat their children in such a way that provokes them to live a life of anger and bitterness, but rather to bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. The Message paraphrases it by instructing parents not to create no-win scenarios for children. It's a good way of putting it. Nevertheless, in the biblical definition, what does it mean to honor someone? Well, simply put, to honor someone is to esteem them by our words and actions as if the person we're honoring, has greater value than us, even if when they don't. What did that look like, though? Particularly, what does it look like when it comes to honoring our parents? What did God have in mind when he included that in his original law? Or what did Paul have in mind when he wrote it to the church of Ephesus? Did he mean that we should just express some nice sentiments from time to time, or get them a nice Hallmark card once a year, or buy them flowers, or take them to dinner once in a while? Well, there's nothing wrong with those things, of course, but I don't think that's exactly what God had in mind. It goes a little deeper than that. Perhaps an even more difficult question to address is, did he mean that we should only show honor to mothers and fathers who were good to us, or only if they were believers? And as Christ followers, are we off the hook if they were the kind of parents who neglected, rejected, or even abused their children or told the children they wouldn't amount to anything? How can a child honor a parent or parents who created lifetime scars on the children, who created no-win scenarios, as the message puts it, that provoke their children to live a lifetime of anger and bitterness? Did you notice that there in that verse in Ephesians, though, that there were no stipulations or exceptions? Neither are there exceptions in Exodus 20 when God made it part of the Ten Commandments. And again, we're going to address some of that momentarily. However, for those that grew up in a more functional relationship with our parents, the way we begin to honor our fathers and mothers, first and foremost, it's simply like Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1 says, through obedience. Through our parents, God uses our time as children to teach us the practice of obedience. Ideally, this would develop within us a pattern of obedience to equip us for later in life when our relationship with God called us to even more challenging demands, so that we become naturally obedient to Him. You know, it's interesting that the only time that we ever read that Jesus had to learn something was in the context of obedience. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8 says that even as the Son of God, He learned obedience from the things that He suffered. Unlike most of us, this doesn't mean that He had to learn obedience by first being disobedient and undergoing the disciplinary consequences. Rather, He learned it through opportunities to be obedient to His earthly parents, which prepared and equipped Him to be obedient to increasingly difficult leadings and challenges from His Heavenly Father. And although we're never told how this process developed, we do know that by the time Jesus was 12 years old, He seemed to have a very clear understanding of His identity. You might recall that it was at age 12 when, after one particular Passover celebration in Jerusalem, His family was heading back to Nazareth, most likely as part of a large caravan. But it was in that moment that Jesus' parents had quite a scare. And assuming that he would have been with other friends or family members in that large group, it took an entire day for his earthly parents, Joseph and Mary, to realize that he wasn't in the caravan. From our perspective, that seems like poor parenting, right? It's like if you want to file that scenario under the heading, you had one job. You had one job to watch the Son of God, and you lost Him. Obviously, there's some historical and cultural context missing from that story. Just curious, how many of you have ever forgot one of your kids at the home or at a mall or something like that? Anybody ever happened to you? Or in a car, or maybe just momentarily? Well, it happened to me, I can tell you that. In fact, the reason why they make the movie Home Alone, and I'm sure it happened quite a few times, but a few days after we brought Abby home from the hospital 22 years ago, Jennifer had to get her license renewed. And I drove her to the license branch, and Abby was asleep in the back seat. Now remember, we had just brought her home within the past week. And in the interest of time and due to parking issues, I dropped Jennifer off at the door and then went and parked. And a few moments later, I walked in to the license branch, and Jennifer was in line, and she gave me the strangest look. And I said, "What?" And she goes, "Where's the baby?" And I freaked out. I'm like, oh my goodness, I never ran so fast in my life. I mean, it was a new experience. It was a brand new habit that I hadn't developed yet. And of course, Abby was still asleep in the back of the car. Parenting, like I said, parenting a baby was a brand new thing for me at this point. It never happened again, though. I was fortunate that it was only a few seconds. Similar stories that have actually ended more tragically. In fact, I don't know if it's true of all new cars, but the one that we rented this last week in Florida actually had a feature built into it that reminds the driver to look in the back seat before they actually get out and shut the car off and get out of the car, which I think is great. Hopefully that will prevent future tragedies. Or maybe you've been the child who was forgotten or had wandered off when your parents weren't looking. Anybody ever done that? Well, my mom reminds me of a story that when I was about 6 or 7 years old, we were on a trip to St. Louis, went to the zoo and went to Six Flags and all that. And we were staying at a Ramada Inn on the 3rd floor. Somehow I got away from them, and being the intelligent kid that I was, I got on the elevator, went down to the 3rd floor to the candy machine, and they had no idea for a second. And so then all of a sudden they realized I was gone. Dad told me, he said he had no problem knowing where I was. He knew exactly where to find me. I was there at the candy machine, so like most kids would be. But anyway, so that was one of those times. Luckily, it was a little bit safer back in those days than it is today. But nevertheless, after realizing Jesus wasn't among their caravan, Joseph and Mary hightailed it back to Jerusalem to look for him. The scriptures say that it took 3 days for them to find him. Isn't that interesting? I've always wondered how they must have prayed about that. You know, it's like, how do you tell God that you lost His only begotten Son and you kind of needed some help finding Him? You know, it's kind of a wonder how they prayed about that. And then the question is, why didn't God, who sees all and knows all, just Now, send an angel to tell them where he was so they didn't have to look for 3 days. And maybe another question is, where did he sleep or how did he eat for those several days? Well, those are questions we don't know the answer to, but they're just things to help us, kind of think about the story a little bit. Nevertheless, that event created a moment forever etched in the mind of Mary when they finally did find Jesus in the temple, answering questions for heathen religious scholars and asking them questions they probably couldn't answer. Just kind of a sneak preview into what the future held. But when they found him, naturally they asked him where he had been all that time. And his answer surprised and bewildered them. He said, "Did you not know that I would be in my Father's house?" Meaning, of course, the temple at that time. But Luke said that after that reunion, Jesus went down to Nazareth and was obedient to them. And remember, at age 12, we only thought we knew more than our parents, right? Jesus actually did, and yet he still obeyed. It created a pattern of obedience that throughout his life and ministry would benefit him. Later on, as Paul would write in Philippians 2:8, we would find out it benefited us too, because it says, being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient, even to the point of death, even death on a cross. So that's where that obedience comes from. And as we get older and become responsible adults, and particularly when we enter into a covenant relationship with a spouse, the concept of being obedient to our parents evolves. We honor them in that season of life by listening to, considering, and remembering the advice and the wisdom of our parents and applying it. In the first 9 verses of Proverbs chapter 31, the author of Proverbs, which we all know as Solomon, tells of the advice that the mother of a king named Lemuel gave to him. Now, we're not told who King Lemuel is. Some have suggested that it might have been a pet name that Bathsheba gave to her son Solomon. It's possible that Solomon is just kind of relaying these things that his mother told him as a youth, but he kind of changed the name of the king so as not to use his own. We don't really know. But whoever it was, the mother's wise advice to her kingly son, or to act in a kingly manner, involved a few things. First, stay away from immoral women, she told him. And secondly, stay away from liquor and those other vices that compromise the character and the judgment befitting of a king, or maybe we could apply it, of a godly man. And third, to always advocate for the underprivileged and those who are oppressed or exploited. Those are the pretty good words of advice from a mother to a son, especially if he's going to be a king. As you have aged and grown wiser, think back, what kind of godly advice did your parents give you that you treasure now as you look back? You know, the things that don't mean that big a deal to us, or they don't seem that important, or maybe we didn't think they were necessarily right when we were kids, but as we get older, we're like, we kind of go from those stages like, my mommy and daddy are the greatest, to my mom and dad don't know anything, to my mom and dad used to say, we kind of go through those stages in life. And then we find ourselves sitting or eating or talking in a way just like our mom and dad did, right? And it's like things we never thought we would do. But as you've aged and grown wiser, what kind of advice do you now treasure? Have you followed that advice? Has it improved the quality of your life? Maybe even saved your life a time or two. And as a result, helped you to live longer. Well, if Lemuel was indeed another name for Solomon, then unfortunately, he didn't follow her advice really well for his whole life. He did for a while. Unfortunately, he eventually used his wisdom and his position to drown himself in wine and wealth and women. Eventually, he even abandoned the gift of wisdom that God had given him for a time when he sought guidance from an occultist medium. And by doing all of that, he not only disappointed God, he actually dishonored his mother. Sadly, our children don't always follow our teaching or our examples. Solomon is just one example. Another one that comes to mind is Samson. I'm not going to go into his story today, but his parents were given the responsibility to raise what they called a Nazarite, right? And one of the things they told him is don't marry outside of the Jewish race. So this wasn't a racial thing, this was a religious thing. And unfortunately he did, and that caused all kinds of problems and to lifelong battles with the Philistines. So by not honoring our parents, sometimes they can lead to some disasterly consequences over the years. We also honor our mothers and fathers by respecting them with our words. God counted the words we say to our parents to be so important that under the old covenant in Exodus 21, verse 17, he said that anyone who cursed his father or mother carried with it a capital punishment. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't disagree with them at times, but it does mean that when we do disagree, we do it respectfully. Trust me, I know that isn't always easy. But nothing and no one can annoy us or get under our skin like those that we love the most, right? Including the words of a parent. But disrespect is reciprocal. When our kids see it in us and how we talk to our parents, they will eventually result in them talking the same way to us one day. Developing a habit of talking respectfully to our parents teaches us to respect for others, and it sets an example for our children to one day follow. Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy 5 that even in his role as the leader of the church, whenever he has a confrontation with an older man or an older woman, to treat them as you would a father or a mother. But that's not all that Paul taught Timothy about the treatment of parents, especially the adults. He also does that another way we honor our parents when we become adults is by caring for them and even providing them financially when necessary. In speaking to those who follow Jesus, Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy 5 verse 4 that if a widow has children or grandchildren, they are to step up in a time of need, financially or otherwise, and give her the help, or him the help, in some cases the widower, that they might need. This is so serious that Paul said a few verses later in 1 Timothy 5:8 that those who don't care for their relatives, especially those in their own household, have denied the faith, and such people are worse than unbelievers. It's a pretty serious charge. And without getting into all the context, in Mark chapter 7, Jesus indicated that to help our parents financially even takes precedence over our giving to the work of the church when necessary. Obviously, there's a degree of wisdom that must be exercised here, though. We don't do any favors by feeding a bottomless pattern of bad decision-making or foolish spending for our kids or for our parents. But for the most part, even the most frugal parents often become the victim of outrageous inflation or a mountain of medical debt or other factors beyond their control. And in those situations, a part of our Christian responsibility is to help them when necessary. We also honor them not only by looking out for their financial help, but their spiritual, physical, and emotional help as well. Jesus made 7 statements while he was on the cross that are recorded for us. Those statements demonstrated his forgiving nature, his fulfilled prophecy, and the completion of his ministry. But hanging there on the cross with his skin torn to shreds, blood pouring out of every wound, his bones out of joint, gasping for every breath he was taking, and struggling with every word he spoke, he looks down and he sees his mother standing next to his cousin and apostle John, and fulfilled his duty as the oldest son of a widow, and assigned him the responsibility to care for her going forward. And the scripture said that she lived with, or that John took her into his home from that day on. Now that's particularly interesting when we consider the fact that Jesus had 4 other brothers, according to scripture. Why didn't he just assign this responsibility to one of his brothers? Well, there's another whole story there, but simply put, because of who Jesus claimed to be and because of his teachings, we know that this caused some real tension in Jesus' family. You think your family has tension? To have one of them claim that they're the Son of God and see how that goes over. Okay, so there's some real tension even in Jesus' family. And the good news is that eventually at least 2 of the family members that we know of became believers, now outside of his mom, meaning 2 of his brothers. But while Jesus was doing this ministry, Mary was trying to kind of navigate this tumultuous relationship between all of those sons. Some of you as parents know what that's like. Some of you may have experienced that when your own kids can't seem to get along for whatever reason. But for all we know, maybe the rest of the brothers just kind of stopped talking to Mary. You know, maybe she felt the tension between Jesus and her other brothers, and they find, we don't know what went on behind the scenes. But here's the point: Jesus didn't leave her safety or provision to brothers who only seemed concerned about themselves. He left his mother in the care of one he trusted would have all of her needs in mind, not just the financial, but also her emotional and her spiritual needs. In his mind, apparently the brothers had lost their right to care for her, at least for that time being. Now, some of you can probably relate to the family dynamic that Jesus was dealing with in his family. Maybe you have other siblings that don't take responsibility of caring for your parents as seriously as you do. I can't count the number of stories that I've heard where only one or maybe 2 of the kids will seek to honor their parent by caring for them in their elderly years, while the rest only kind of wait around and see what kind of inheritance or contribution they're going to get when the parent passes on. I see this over and over again. It's easier for those kids, those particular people, to sit back and to criticize the one that's actually trying to take care of the parents rather than contribute, whether financially or in some other way. And I think there's a couple principles for the believer to kind of take away from the story of Jesus overseeing the care of his mother. First, as a follower of Jesus, even if there's some unpleasant history or bad blood or tension in the family, it does not excuse us from honoring our mother or our father. It's not an excuse to avoid or to evade a responsibility to care for them when necessary. We don't do it to please a parent, we do it to please the Lord. Secondly, if for some reason we have to leave our parent in the care of another, whether professional or otherwise, due to distance or some other reason, then it's important to entrust them to someone who not only makes sure their physical needs are met, but also takes their spiritual needs and emotional needs into consideration as well. Perhaps the most important way, though, to honor our mother or father, particularly if we grew up under the care of a godly mother, is to follow her in her faith. In 2 Timothy 1, Paul reflects on Timothy's own upbringing by pointing out the heritage of faith in his grandmother Lois that was carried on through his mother Eunice and eventually into Timothy. Paul says, "For this reason, I call you to fan into flame the gift of God within you." With what reason? Well, because of his godly heritage. He reminds Timothy that he has no excuse not to know and not to follow Jesus. And I know without a shadow of a doubt that one of the reasons I stand before you today is because of the faith of both of my grandmothers and that my parents invested into me. Thanks to my grandmother on my mom's side, I actually preached my first sermon at Pasadena United Methodist Church at the age of 8 years old. There it is right there. It's kind of a funny story with that. I had a King James Bible back in those days, and it was my grandmother had bought it for me, and it was a defective Bible. And what I mean by that is that in the printing, I guess they still do it someday where they put pictures in the Bible. Well, there were certain sections that were flipped over, turned upside down, and so that she got it at a discount. So when you look at Matthew chapter 12, maybe for example, and you flip the page, there would be Luke 14 upside down. So every once in a while, I'd have to turn the Bible upside down to go to something else. And after I got done, I never will forget, a lady asked my mom, "Does he have problems reading?" And she had to explain to her why I was turning this Bible upside down. But I don't know where that is. She may have become too old. I don't know. But anyway, that was just kind of a funny story. And I still remember I preached on loving your neighbor. That was my very first sermon at 8 years old. But that came because of a rich heritage of faith from my grandmothers and from my mom. My becoming a pastor not only answered the call that God placed on my life, but as a byproduct also became a way for me to honor the influence they had on me. If your mom or dad is or was a believer and someone you aspire to be like in some ways, then have the courage to follow in their first steps of faith. Now, to address the difficult question I introduced earlier, what if you or someone you know did not have godly parents? What if you or someone you know came from a horrific background of neglect or abuse or rejection? What if they had a deeply flawed expression of their faith in God and became overbearing with their faith or lacked the grace that you expected to see from one who follows Jesus? Well, as a Christian, how do we navigate the tension between the command to honor a seriously flawed parent and the anger and the bitterness that they have spent years holding on to and cultivating? How do we deal with all that? But can I just say this? All parents are screw-ups. I'm one of them, right? But guess what? So are you. So am I. We're all screw-ups. We're all flawed people. And yes, sadly, some way more so than others. But even in those circumstances, through the power of grace and forgiveness, we can still obey God in this directive to honor our parents by honoring the position, if not the person. We are commanded to honor the authorities of government, in spite of the fact that they may stand for and promote everything we stand against, simply because they are in that position under the control of God. In the same way, we honor the position of parenthood or parent by acknowledging that in spite of all their flaws, and sometimes even their evil, they are still in that position because God allowed them to be there, and even used their atrocities to somehow advance His plan, which includes you. Now, I know that's a weird way of looking at it. But in His sovereign wisdom, God used their DNA to create only what they could create, you. Okay, so there's something good that comes out of it. That's a hard pill to swallow as a human being. To accept the fact that a person who is supposed to have our best interests at heart and instead exploited that position to manipulate, neglect, or abuse us can still be used by God to create beauty in you for His own glory. And yet the truth stands that somehow God in His infinite wisdom and His unfathomable sense of justice used those two human beings to bring you into the world. And that in spite of that incomprehensible upbringing, He can still redeem it and redeem you for His glory. So even if you can't think of a positive thing to say or recall one moment of joy as a child of horrible parents, God says to honor that truth anyway. And one of the ways we do that is by forgiving the deeply flawed parent. As you've heard me say more than once, forgiving someone is not about whether that person has acknowledged their sins against you or apologized for their treatment of you. Regardless of all that, forgiveness is about your ability to not let the sins of others manipulate you, control you, or equip you with an excuse to travel a path that is detrimental to your own life, or to continue a cycle of destruction that is devastating to your own family's life. It's not about letting those who hurt you off the hook. It's about freeing you from the hold that bitterness and anger and hatred can have on you. Forgiving others is for your benefit, especially those who have hurt you the deepest. In many cases, forgiveness is the key that unlocks the door to creating a new family tree or new family heritage. To change that cycle, First, by receiving forgiveness from God through the blood of Christ, and then by accessing the power of forgiveness in you because of the Holy Spirit to forgive those who have wronged you. You have an opportunity to change that family tree. And seeking God's power and strength to help you find a way to forgive those who hurt you the deepest, especially a parent, honors the God who calls you to honor your father or mother. It's the most honorable thing you can do for them in many cases. And who knows what kind of relationship it can develop from that point on. Most of all, it's important to remember that God had enough love and compassion to overcome all the mistakes of any poor parent. Psalm chapter 27, verse 10 says, "Even if my father and mother abandon me, the Lord will hold me close." He treats us as a mother is expected to treat her children, or as a father is expected to treat his children. In recording God's heart toward his children, Isaiah writes, "As one whom his mother comforts, so I will comfort you. You shall be comforted in Jerusalem. You shall see, and your heart shall rejoice. Your bones shall flourish like the grass." Because why? Because God can redeem you and can redeem that situation for your good. Remember that the promise of the long life of blessing in Ephesians 6 isn't based on how well or how poorly your parents may have done in raising you. The quality of life is connected to how you honor them for the position they were given and how you respond. Remember, to honor someone is to esteem them as if they have greater value even when they don't. It improves the quality of your life because those expressions reflect the honor you give God for placing those authorities in your life, which he used in some providential way to bring you to this moment, even if it wasn't convenient growing up. So today, knowing that most of you were raised by wonderful parents, I just want to challenge you to celebrate and to honor your mother, whether they are still with you or not, whether they were the ideal parent or not, by celebrating with others in your family or with friends the positive thing that she does or that she did. Share how her role in your life shaped you, how God used them to help create within you something he has called you to do. Share with your own children or grandchildren some words of wisdom or valuable piece of advice that she gave you to improve the quality of your own life. And if indeed she was a reflection of God's own heart, follow her faith, the first steps of her faith, so that your faith reflects hers. If it so happens that you or someone you know or someone you meet has less than ideal memories or less than warm sentiments toward their mother, then perhaps share with them the power of forgiveness and how that forgiveness can release them from that bitterness and help them begin a new family heritage. So with all those thoughts this morning, I want to pray that you will take time to honor your mother or her memory in some special way today or maybe, but more importantly to honor the Lord by honoring his command to honor your parent. If there's bitterness in the past of you or someone you know, then help them turn Mother's Day into a day they no longer dread, but a day that they can learn the power of forgiveness and the freedom from the hatred or the bitterness that they may have been holding on to. Let's pray.